erection, and it's very similar. We changed the sympathetic for emission, but the sensory pathway is still the same. Can I erase that half of the board over there that talked about the quiz? You guys have that down? What we're okay. So let me go through the images, and then I will diagram it again on the board. All right, you guys can stop and ask questions if we slow down at all. So this component here is showing sections of the spinal cord, and then we have the sympathetic chain, where we have the sympathetic fibers and the penis. These two nerves are the same, the pudendal nerve, sensory and motor. All right. So let's look at this diagram over here. I put this one up during my office hours yesterday. So, ventral rami coming from the sacral spinal cord. You guys know what I talk about when I say ventral rami? Okay, those are ventral roots, for those of you that don't. Spinal cord, dorsal root, ventral root. All right? Dorsal root has a dorsal root ganglion. And then the spinal nerve itself gives rise to a ventral ramus and a dorsal ramus. So ventral is motor, dorsal is sensory. You guys remember that part? Spinal nerve is mixed. Spinal nerve has both motor and sensory. So the ventral rami are motor and sensory neurons supplying the trunk of the body, the upper and lower limbs. Dorsal rami, we won't talk about it all this semester. It supplies skin and muscle about a 4-inch wide width on each side of the spinal cord, going all the way up to the neck. So really deep muscles along the back that keep your posture erect. All right, and then sensory to the skin. So we kind of don't need to talk about that this semester. Ventral rami are the branches of the one would be ramus. So these are the rami coming through the greater sciatic notch. So these are the ventral rami coming out of the spinal, sacral spinal cord right here. Sacral ventral rami. Okay? And then coming off of that are the neurons that form the pudendal nerve. Sensory and motor are found in the pudendal nerve. When we talk about the sensory pathway for erection, there's a psychogenic pathway that I have listed in your lecture notes, and that's mind over matter and seeing Playboy magazine and all that kind of stuff. All right, so we're going to deal with sensory from the glans penis. So sensory travels along the dorsal nerve of the penis. When I drew the cross section of the penis, or you saw it, the monkey face, corpus cavernosum, corpus spongiosum with the urethra, and we have the dorsal vein, dorsal arteries, and dorsal nerves. So that's the dorsal nerve of the penis that I'm talking about. That's sensory. Coming from the glans penis, which has the greatest number of sensory endings, and travels in and becomes part of the pudendal nerve. Part of the pudendal nerve also innervates the vulval spongiosus and ischial cavernosus muscles that we'll talk about with ejaculation. All right? Those are perineal branches that I said we weren't going to worry about individual names. But dorsal nerve of the penis is sensory. So that's what's being shown here, even though for some reason they took it out of the penis, like it's hanging down to the side somewhere. So you can see the direction of the information is going up to the spinal nerve. Okay? So that's dorsal nerve of the penis, and I'm going to put this up here a little bit higher. And we're talking about sacral spinal cord. Sensory pathway. Those arrows aren't part of the neuron. I'm just showing you the direction of the information. it joins a bunch of other nerves and becomes the pudendal nerve. All right. So hence sensory stimuli via dorsal nerve of the penis through the pudendal nerve, and that enters into the sacral spinal cord. All right. In the sacral spinal cord is a group of neurons now actually identified as the erection center. And so if a guy's in a motorcycle accident or for some reason damages his spinal cord above this, then he can still have an erection even if he's a paraplegic. All right, and can still have an orgasm, can still ejaculate, and have intercourse. He may not have any feelings of that orgasm, but he and his partner can still have sex and create a baby. He can still pleasure his partner, even though he may not actually have sensations from his last penis. And this is not something that the doctors or nurses are going to tell a brand new paraplegic, but it's something that would be discussed along the way. It depends on the height and there's training that occurs. This is a visceral reflex, so we're involving autonomic nerves with erection. Right? So for erection, do the penile arterioles need to dilate or to constrict? Dilate. Remember I said typically it's sympathetic nerves that go to smooth muscle. They are constantly firing, maintaining a slight state of contraction or tone. When those vessels need to constrict, that firing increases in rate. If they need to dilate, the firing decreases. So it's a matter of degree. Parasympathetic does not typically go to blood vessels. Here in this pathway, it does. So what part of the sympathetic fibers, as far as central nervous system, are described as being a thoracic lumbar system? So thoracic spinal cord and lumbar spinal cord are where we find the preganglionic neurons of our two neuron system. What phrase do we use to describe the location of preganglionic neurons for parasympathetic? If sympathetic is thoracic lumbar.
Sacral.
Cranial.
Sacral.
Sacral. All right, so we have 4 cranial nerves, vagus being one of them, facial, glossopharyngeal, ocular motor. So here we're looking at the sacral portion of the spinal cord. So the motor neurons that are parasympathetic are going to come out the ventral root because they're motor, and they're going to come off of the ventral ramus and travel to the pelvis. Those of you that had me last semester, those neurons of the pelvis that form what we call the rat's nest.
Oh, this one.
What's its anatomical term?
Plexus.
Hypogastric plexus, inferior hypogastric plexus. For those of you, here is Netter's image.
Wait, 390.
Okay. So, to reorient you, here are the ventral rami. All right. Here is the pudendal nerve and the dorsal nerve of the penis, joining with the pudendal nerve, going through the ventral rami into the spinal cord. And then preganglionic parasympathetic fibers come out the same ventral rami, and right here are coming off the ventral rami and going into the rat's nest, inferior hypogastric plexus. Okay. So I'll write that on the board. It's a plexus. It's a whole bunch of nerves coming in and synapsing. Most of them are sympathetic. And remember, those of you that had me last semester, the parasympathetic, typically the pathway was they went to the wall of the organ. That would go into the wall of the urinary bladder or into the wall of the uterus to synapse with the postganglionic neuron. In this case, they synapse in the plexus. So this convolution of nerves in the pelvis itself is known as the inferior hypogastric plexus. And what do we call the nerves that come off of the ventral rami?
Splenic.
Splanchnic nerves.
Oh, you're so smart.
Parasympathetic. Okay? So those are preganglionic. In the hypogastric plexus, they will synapse with the cell body of the postganglionic neurons, and those will travel to the penile arterioles. It's a fancy way of saying the arterioles of the penis. And this is given a name. We don't usually name them because they're very, very short in the parasympathetic system. So these are called the cavernous nerves. And they're on this diagram here. Let me move this slide up a little bit so those of you in the back. These are Netter's diagrams again. So here's the inferior hypogastric plexus, and here are the cavernous nerves going back into the penis, whereas this was the dorsal nerve of the carrying the sensory information away. So in our visceral reflex, we have sensory information coming from the dorsal nerve of the penis, going up to the spinal cord, synapsing with the motor, which is our pelvic splanchnic nerve, coming off right here, and synapsing, and our postganglionic neuron forming the cavernous nerve, and that goes and is associated with the blood supply. Pardon?
Smooth muscle.
Yes. The smooth muscle and the lining, the epithelial lining. So let's look at, to follow the pudendal pathway. We looked at this without the nerves when we were looking at erectile tissue. And here's the pudendal nerve right here, right? Forming the pudendal nerve are branches from the anal sphincter, branches from the bulbospongiosis and ischiocavernosus and urogenital diaphragm. Those branches I said you didn't have to know, just pudendal nerve. And then cut right here, cutting through the urogenital diaphragm. This is the dorsal nerve of the penis, carrying the sensory information from glans penis. And then forming the pudendal nerve. And then here, still looking from the back, rather than the person lying on their back, here's the pudendal nerve coming over the ischial spine, back into the greater sciatic notch, on its way to join with the ventral ray line. So from this anterior view, we have the pudendal nerve carrying sensory information coming through here, and then we have the pelvic splanchnics, and then the cavernous nerve. Okay? So that's the sensory motor and sensory pathways that look rather confusing on this diagram. So on this diagram, here's the sensory pathway with the dorsal nerve of the penis. Here's the motor pathway with preganglionic nerves described as pelvic, but pelvic splanchnic, and then the postganglionic nerves being the cavernous nerve. This is a new slide that I put together yesterday afternoon. So I'll, when I get access, either in office hours tomorrow, or if my computer's working tonight, if I try that button, I'll put it up there as an addendum slide underneath male reproductive lecture. I'll just say erection pathway or something like that, so you can utilize those. Okay? So now, that's our pathway, all right? Sensory, and then motor pathway getting back to the blood vessels. The blood vessels are smooth muscle, so that's why we're using an autonomic nerve pathway rather than motor nerves, because those would require skeletal. So let's look at the next slide on some of the cell biochemistry. This is the pathway on here. And
Sorry.
that's fine.
We need to know why motor nerve goes there.
No, it's, I'll show it up here. It's kind of a unique situation for this. So let me tell you from this slide what you need to know, because there's words on there that I include that you don't have to be able to repeat. Myosin light chain kinase, you don't have to know all about that. I'll tell you what's happening. So let me explain. Parasympathetic neurons release nitric oxide gas, and there are receptors for those on the smooth muscle. In addition, acetylcholine is used. So remember, our neurotransmitter for the preganglionic, the postganglionic is acetylcholine. And our neurotransmitter down here is also acetylcholine and nitric oxide. So how do both of those work? Our postganglionic neuron releases acetylcholine into the endothelial cell, the lining of the blood vessel, and other cells, the cavernous nerves can also release nitric oxide directly to the smooth muscle. So the endothelial cell lining can make nitric oxide, or the neuron itself can release nitric oxide as a result of acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is our typical neurotransmitter for the parasympathetic nervous system. So this diagram is showing the smooth muscle cell. There's a lot of words on there, and I know when I read something that I don't understand what all the abbreviations are for, it's hard to learn it. My eyes just kind of skip over it if I have to stop and see what everything is making sense of. So the two things that I want you to understand is the muscle cell relaxes because the myosin head has phosphate groups removed from it and no longer works as an ATPase. And the muscle cell relaxes because calcium ions are pumped back up into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. So with low calcium, binding sites on actin become covered and it can't contract. So these are the two events. So these slides, again, I'll put up. The myosin, again, you don't have to know that whole term, but here basically the myosin head no longer is flipping back and forth in its cocked and uncocked position. And two, calcium ions are pumped back into the sarcoplasmic reticulum. With both of those events due to cyclic GMP activation, the muscle cell relaxes. Do you guys remember the cyclic GMP pathway? Does it involve a G protein?
Yes.
No.
That was one of those pathways after we talked about. So here's our receptor, and guanylate cyclase was directly associated with the receptor, and GTP would form cyclic GMP without a G protein intervention. Okay, this is one of the first examples I gave of a hormone receptor not using G protein. And then phosphodiesterase, remember, broke down both cyclic GMP and cyclic AMP. Okay, so this is how this works. So a protein kinase then is responsible for these two events that result in the muscle relaxation. So this is unusual. I don't know why it's done this way. It's unusual to have parasympathetic innervation result in arterial smooth muscle relaxing in this fashion. Usually when we have parasympathetic resulting in smooth muscle relaxation is potassium ions and inhibition, all that kind of stuff. But this particular sequence is a bit unusual. Something I didn't know about until I was preparing these slides yesterday, so this is just for free because I haven't confirmed it from any other source. This is unique to male, all right? Well, rephrase that. Both male and female will use this nitric oxide pathway. In addition, in female, the parasympathetic pathway, the parasympathetic neurons will actually also synapse with sympathetic. I don't know of any other situation. The parasympathetic effector, what the synapse is, instead of being a muscle, is another sympathetic neuron. Causes that sympathetic neuron to fire, or rather inhibits the sympathetic neuron from firing, and therefore, because sympathetic isn't firing, we have our normal relaxation of smooth muscle. Now, why female does that and not male, or they just haven't found the pathway in male, I just read that on one article, okay? which just seemed really interesting, that the parasympathetic fibers would directly inhibit the sympathetic activity. But this is the more understood component here. So parasympathetic acetylcholine and nitric oxide is, when acetylcholine is released, nitric oxide is going to be made, or nitric oxide can be made directly. And then nitric oxide as a gas is a neurotransmitter and has receptors and results in these two changes, inactivation of myosin and the removal of the calcium from the cytoplasm. And both of those results in smooth muscle relaxation. The arterioles dilate. They're right next to thin walls of veins, and that then results in erection as the veins keep the blood from leaving the erectile tissue of the penis.